David. I'm director here of the Margaret Walker Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you for this lecture tonight, the first of a three-part series by Dr. Deborah Barnes here at JSU. We're excited to be the first host here in Air Hall. Along with being director of the Margaret Walker Center, I'm also an assistant professor of history at Jackson State in the College of Liberal Arts, and are very glad to see so many people here for this event tonight. The Margaret Walker Center, if you do not know, is a museum and archive dedicated to the African American experience. We were founded by the late, great Dr. Margaret Walker Alexander in 1968 as the Institute for the Study of the History, Life, and Culture of Black People, one of the very first Black studies programs anywhere in the nation, founded here at Jackson State. This year, 2015, constitutes what would have been Margaret Walker's centennial year. She would have turned 100 years old on July 7th, 2015. Over the course of this year, we will be having a series of events to celebrate and lift up Dr. Alexander over this year into what we like to say is the national consciousness, where we really believe she belongs. As a professor of English here at JSU from 1949 to 1979, she played an incredibly important role here for our students and for our community and for the larger world as both an artist, a writer, an intellectual, a scholar, a teacher. And of course, being our founder, we're very proud of her academic and artistic legacy. And so we hope that you'll join us over the course of this year. We do have some of these brochures about some of our upcoming events, and including some past events that we've had. But check us out on our website. You can also follow us on all the usual formats, Twitter, Facebook, and so forth. And would love to see you at some of our upcoming events. Dr. Deborah H. Barnes is Associate Professor of English and graduate faculty at Jackson State University. She served previously as Associate Dean and Interim Dean for the College of Liberal Arts, where she led an initiative to revise the undergraduate curriculum. In 2009, she published On Building Me a Home, an interdisciplinary reader and workbook for African American experience, 2 volumes. This work was to provide new angles of vision on African American studies for a general education core at North Carolina A&T State University. She's published articles on Nobel laureate Toni Morrison, Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, and Sterling A. Brown, as well as historical culture workers Harriet Tubman, Arthur Schomburg, and Arthur P. Davis. Most recently, she has turned her attentions to the social phenomenon of lynching, identifying a new genre of literary discourse, the lynching narratives, which you will hear about over the course of these 3 lectures beginning tonight. She is currently editing and annotating an anthology of these melodramatic, voyeuristic accounts of a specific lynching that were written and or published by a lynching participant, spectator, sympathizer, apologist, or victim. Dr. Barnes is a co-founder of the Toni Morrison Society and has served in many administrative capacities. She is also, perhaps most importantly, the mother of 1 son, Jeffrey Chaucer Barnes, a member of our National Council here at the Margaret Walker Center, and certainly, most importantly, 2 grandchildren, Emerson, who is 5, and Hurston, who is 6 weeks old. Please help me welcome Dr. Barnes.
Thank you for coming. Look how many people. I feel like it's my birthday or something. I want to do a couple of things before I start talking, just to put you in the right mood. First of all, I put that PowerPoint, look, you got out of class. Put that PowerPoint presentation up, and I hope you had a chance to see all of it. Because that's not what I'm going to talk about. And that's what you came here expecting me to talk about, was the brutality and the bloodlust of lynching, the torn and bruised bodies we know about that part. I want to talk about something else, but I wanted you to have the benefit of seeing sort of an overview of what all that is about, so you'll understand the part that I'm going to talk about following that. As a founder of the Toni Morrison Society, I take great pride in the fact that I can figure out how to quote Toni Morrison in any circumstance. I got a million of them. So let me start with this one. And that is, this is the last line of the introduction to The Bluest Eye, her first novel. And she says, there's really nothing more to say except why. But since why is difficult to handle, one must take refuge in how. And so today I want us to talk about how lynching was able to proliferate in the way that it did, most people will say, for 51 years, 29th, it was much, much longer, and some would argue is still ongoing. So we're gonna talk about how that phenomenon happens. My assistant is helping me. Somebody please buy the university a clicker. Please, when it's time to give money in one of those campaigns, please buy the school a clicker. Okay, so the way that I wanna talk about it over the next 3 lectures, they're all interwoven, and I have promised some of the stalwart of you who come to all 3 $20. Don't make it. And the reason I'm hoping at least 1 or 2 people come to all 3 is because they really are all interconnected, and they all are about something that's very different than perhaps what you know already about lynching. So the first one today, I want to do 2 things at once in all of them. I want to talk about the phenomenon of lynching and from some particular perspective, but I also want to talk about how we study it. I've been thinking about curriculum seemingly forever. I was lucky to get my wings, so to speak, where I earned tenure at a school, a small private liberal arts college, which was unequivocal about excellent teaching. They enforced it, and they created an environment where teaching excellence was able to manifest. And so we were always thinking about pedagogy. And I left that school to go to A&T, at least in part, to go to A&T, because they were thinking about revamping their entire general education curriculum. I've been in the academy for so long, Lord have mercy, I think this is my 26th year. How can that be if I'm only 26 years old? But in the time that I've been here, things have changed comprehensively. There was a time when all you had to do was remember things. Like when I was in undergraduate school, if you could remember everything for the test, you were good to go. Okay, and then a little bit later, you had to be able to apply it to some things. And now everything in the world has changed. As Dr. Blaine likes to say, what does one do with information in an environment where information is ubiquitous? We don't need you to memorize everything, because you can Google anything you want to know, have it at your fingertips. Now, what you do with that information when you get it is the next question. So I want to talk about why we don't know the things we don't know. There's a reason why we don't know what we don't know, and part of it has nothing to do with being too lazy to look. It's a big part of it, but that's not the only part of it. So we're going to talk about that today. Next Tuesday, I'm going to talk about black lynch mobs. I'm willing to bet you didn't know there were black lynch mobs. Okay, one of you may know. Most of you didn't know, but I don't believe you knew that. Because you always think of black people as being the victims of racial violence and not the perpetrators. Okay, and so embedded in history somewhere is this phenomenon that there were black lynch mobs, and black lynch mobs, for the records, not only lynched black people, but lynched white people with impunity. I mean, they lynched them and went on about their business and had Wednesday, okay? So what I want to talk about there is how difficult it is to research something that is unimaginable, or in some people's mindset doesn't even exist. If there's no such thing as a black lynch mob, tell me how you're going to find out more. It's difficult. I've managed. Stay tuned. The third one, I want to talk about the book that I'm working on, Written in Blood, The Discourse of Lynching. And these are all lynching narratives, which are first-person eyewitness accounts that were written either by the lynchers themselves. This is an industry where people are very proud of the work that they do. So they published accounts of how they protected their community, and they had pictures and names and times and places. Nobody is hiding lynching events. These are coffee table books. They were published in real publishing houses, and yet very little is known about them. That's how I'm gonna retire. So this is what my last one is on, and I want to talk about there how by doing this they have constructed reality and truth, or the politics of meaning. So we're going to get into that a little bit today, but I just want to set you up for this riveting series that is coming. So you got to work with me. I'm going like this. Okay, so first I want to tell you how I became interested in lynching, because most people will think that that is just too macabre a topic for anybody to want to focus on. I got to lynching the way I get to everything, Toni Morrison. Her 7th novel, Paradise, written in 1997, begins with a lynching by a black lynch mob. I thought it was a metaphor. I thought it was just her being fictive. And I began to work on a paper that I was gonna present, and the more I looked into it, this is when I began to learn what lynching really was. The further I got into it, the more I had to explore not only lynching, but the founding of the 26 all-black towns in the Midwest, which is where this lynching takes place. So the men are lynching these women in an effort to protect the towns that they have built. So I began to do that research, and the further I got into it, I stumbled upon one of these narratives. In the footnotes, I see a lot of students in here. I'm getting ready to give you some really important information now. You ready? Write this down. Ready? No, look ready. Always look in the footnotes. I know you skipped the footnotes. They're boring and they're little. Okay, but that's where the juice is. That's where the gravy is. That's where all the heavy lifting has already been done. So somebody put in the footnotes this narrative, and I was living in Washington at the time, so I went down to the Library of Congress and read it, and there were 2 more on the shelf next to it. And so I read those, and then there were 3, and I said, if there are 3, there must be more. And I began to look for those, and by that time, I was in. And I was in because I realized there was so much more to this than just the part we all know. Now, the part we all know is bad. Please agree with this, because you gotta understand, I've been looking at those pictures about 12 years. I can look at them and eat a sandwich at the same time. But that doesn't mean that when I first started in this area, I wasn't hurling things across the room in anger and frustration. But at some point, you become almost numb to it. And this is one of the points that I want to make tonight, that if they are lynching, the statistic is that 2 to 3 people were lynched every week for 51 years. That's a lot of people. That means that so many people were lynched, people stop thinking about it. Think how many people are shot, right? Think how many people are shot by cops. If there's not a groundswell of resistance where people rally in the street, you say, Lord, I just shot another one, and you go on. Right? And at first, every time somebody shot up a school, you couldn't turn the TV off. Now you're like, oh, they shot up another school. Do that for 51 years. And it got to the point where people didn't even pay attention to it because it had just become understood as part of what the culture is. Now, part of the reason it went on is because lynching is a social control. It created the world that made it manageable for power to have its way. So that's the second thing I want to talk about. And then finally, I want to come back around to what this means for teaching. As I started to say a minute ago, I have been thinking about curriculum for a really long time. And it becomes important to think about not only what you're going to teach, but how you're going to teach it. And most importantly, what do you want people to do when they finish? If you don't want them to just be able to say what you said back to you, there's no reason for that. Now, everybody's cell phone got a recorder on it, right? Then you have to put into the system what it is you want people to do so that they're able to do it when the time comes. Okay, so let's start with the definition of lynching. Lynching must first have tangible evidence that an illegal public execution of an alleged criminal, doesn't mean they are, by 3 or more vigilantes who claim to do it in service to justice or tradition. If they're not 3 people, it's not a lynching. Okay, very recently they found some more people in the truck that took Emmett Till away, but for the last 50 years it was 2 brothers. It was the husband and the brother-in-law. That was not a lynching. And yet, is that not the most famous lynching anybody knows about? It doesn't qualify as a lynching because it needs 3 or more people. And it used to say, and they took this out, that it had to interrupt the justice system. So somebody had to have taken the person into the justice system. They either had to have accused them, arrested them, put them in a patrol car or the wagon, whichever it was, and started back in order for, and that process had to be interrupted for it to be a lynching, okay? So they're basically, lynchers are saying, we don't have time for the justice system, we're gonna just do this ourselves. So, one of the ways that I wanted to think about this, and I wanted to talk about this, let me start that sentence again. I didn't start in the right place. in revising the curriculum here at Jackson State, I asked the chairs of the departments to ask their departments, what does it mean for you to have a degree in the discipline you're pursuing? If you are a political science major, what do you want political science majors to be able to do when they come out? Not what read or what, you know, what papers they wrote. What should a political scientist do? What should a person in psychology be able to do if they're not a clinician? If they're a clinician, we know what they're going to do. So I wanted to think about this from the vantage point of my own discipline. Nobody knows why anybody should have an English degree. Most people have English degrees because they flunk out of everything else. They thought they were going to be an engineer. They're not. They thought they were going to be a doctor. They're not. Okay, so they go 2 or 3 places, and finally they say, shoot, I can read a book. I'll go over there. I am sorry to say that's how we end up with most folks. That's okay, because if we're lucky, we can rehabilitate them and bring them around. Okay, so what English people do, the good ones, is we look at the ways that narrative constructs reality. So we're talking about poetry, we're talking about novels, we're talking about nonfiction. How do writers construct reality in such a way that what they are writing about becomes real? There is no reality until someone says there is. I can be real deep now, we don't even have any liquor in here. It'd be better if we did. They had some cocktails first, but I'm getting ready to be deep with you, right? Okay, so we don't know what reality is until somebody says this is what's real. And the way that you come to know what's real is through various disciplines, or certainly through various institutional orientations. So you believe what's real based on, let's call it Christianity. You believe it based on science. You believe it based on history. But you come to this notion of what things mean from a vantage point, okay? So English people are trying to look at the ways that various writers and certainly cultural workers construct a reality in such a way that we accept it as real. And I want you to remember, everybody in here is in college, right, or been. You took 3 English classes no matter who you were, probably. You took 2 composition classes, and I'm going to say a world lit class, or something like that. And if you're smart, you probably had to take something else like a literature, what do you call it, you know, where you read around, what do you call that? You read everything.
Great books.
That's not what I mean. I can't even think of it because I don't like those courses anyway. When you read it, you know, you read a chapter out of a novel and you read 3 poems and you think you understand the world. American Lit Survey. That's what it is. Most people take a survey class, right? Okay, so you've had a lot of literature. And the reason that people have you read that literature, particularly what they consider to be the great authors, is because they are showing you how to understand what's real and true. And if you don't like it, it's just proof you're not smart. Smart people like that. They get it. They're like, oh yeah. And then pretend they like it even if they don't. Because that's what it means to be smart and to understand. Okay, so English people are concerned with the ways we put things together in such a way that we convey what they mean and that we can be smart. This is what I'm trying to figure out about lynching. How have they put the story of lynching together in such a way that everybody, black and white, east and west, buys into it? Now there's some people horrified by it. There are people in this room right here horrified by gun violence, but I bet a bunch of you got guns. The biggest argument I had with the administrative assistant in the dean's office was she had a gun. And I'm like, well, who you gonna kill? She's like, you don't have a gun? I'm like, no, I'm not prepared to murder anybody. Well, if they gonna murder you, I'm like, we all going from something. I'm not going to murder somebody and have orange is the new black. I'm not doing it. Okay, so even when we're against things, we buy into that framework because America is rooted in violence and guns. Okay, so I don't care how many babies get killed by guns, we're not going to outlaw them until the right one does. Okay, so the way that this reality is conveyed is through a master narrative. And there is the master narrative, even if you don't recognize it as that. The American master narrative, which establishes the reality of what it means to be American involves some of these things. My list is not exhaustive, but it is complete, okay? And so it is rooted, at least in part, in the concept of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny says that God put white people on the planet to civilize it. This is why they're here. To America. I don't mean the planet. America. That he brought them here and gave them a garden to develop in order to get the best out of it. And they took that to heart, and that meant that anybody who was in the way of that objective had to go. Now, they weren't being mean about it. God told them to do it. Noah built the ark, and they decided they had to civilize America. And if they had to civilize it by killing up everybody, that's how God wants it. Okay, so it codifies whiteness. There are no white people until a narrative establishes whiteness. There are Europeans, there are French people, English people, there are Welsh people in the mines, there are Chinese and Mexican people, there are Californians, which have been wiped out almost completely, so you may not know about them. There are all kinds of people who have ethnic identities, and it's not until manifest destiny and toward the end of slavery, certainly by the end of slavery, that whiteness gets constructed as an identity. This master narrative helps to do that. And they do it in effort to support manifest destiny. Whiteness is based upon honor, Christianity, and patriarchy. And that means I'll kill you if you talk about my mama, because God told me to do it, and the man is always in charge. And everything about America is situated on at least these three prongs. There's some more stuff, but these three prongs are the primary ones. Okay, so it codifies in gendered identity, that means anybody that's not a man, as dependent and subordinate. So even though you have women who are settling the West and coming across on those ships too, it's real, they're dependent on the man to help them do that. It defines social reality as material. Now this is one of the things that makes them fall out with indigenous people. Indigenous people believed that the environment, they were one with the environment, they were part of the natural order. But they believed that social reality is material, that it's about the things. It's about the cars and the houses and all the stuff that you can buy that determines what is real and true. And that natural resources are infinite, available, and free. All you gotta do is go out there and dig them up. And God wants them to do that because that's what manifest destiny says. In fact, they say that they had all these indigenous people here who didn't do the right thing with these resources. They just don't get it. They're out there praying to the water when they ought to be sucking it up and sending it to Vegas, right? Okay, more on the master narrative. Oh, I have this here, I don't have to look up there. Let me get on the right page. Nope. Oh, okay, so invariably it projects mainstream culture as being under threat. Somebody is always trying to corrupt the status quo. And non-whites, so it calls for armed resistance, domination, control, removal, or extermination to alleviate that threat. How do you get people who are in the way? What about illegal aliens? People coming across the border. You want a job, you don't have a job after college, go down there and guard that wall. They always have jobs down there in Texas trying to keep people from coming over the wall. Why? Because they are a threat to white supremacy in that area. And so anybody who gets in the way has to either be transformed or eliminated. And because of that, this narrative justifies racist legislation and dispossession. This is the way you get rid of them. It normalizes vigilantism. If you gotta go and kill a couple of them, that's just what you gotta do. Racial exploitation, let's put them all in a sweatshop. Right? They're not gonna get a job at a college. So isn't that what NAFTA was? Let's go down there and build some factories and give them some jobs. That's NAFTA. And then violent censure. And social domination is leveraged through fraud. They call it statecraft, which is legislation. Force, repression, and violence. So everything that you read in American Lit, if you understand this code, you will see these things embedded in all of the discourses that come out of the mainstream. It projects, oh wait a minute, next. Okay, so taking that into consideration, what we are missing in the ways that we have thought about lynching heretofore, the slides that I've shown you, is that most people think of lynching as the illegal murder of black men, mostly men and some women, but almost completely black people, right? And mostly in the South. When in fact, people were lynched in every state in the Union except 3. And they were lynched in all kinds of areas and all kinds of people. And one of the things that has really fueled my research, I left this out when I talked about how I got started. I found 2 things. I found that lynching narrative, and I found a little news article about this big, and it said 12 Chinese people were lynched at one time in a city in Idaho. And I looked for those Chinese people for 10 years. I mean, I kept going back to WorldCat, and I wrote librarians in Idaho all over the world, and 1 or 2 answered me, and they told me where I could find some information. It was in a newspaper, but I never could find any information until 2 weeks ago. I managed to put my hands on a book that was just published, it's gonna be at the end, called Driven Out. And it's about how Chinese people were lynched and purged and murdered wholesale by the thousands in this country. But we don't ever hear about that. And we don't ever hear about that because lynching is constructed as a black thing. Right? Like all football players and basketball players are black. If we watch TV, we know they're not all black, but that's how we think about it, right? And so by not thinking that there are other sorts of people who are also having the exact same thing visited upon them, if we factor that in, that changes a lot about what's happening. Now, Chinese are not the only ones. They're Mexicans, as I said, Californios, who were people who were living in California before it was ceded, right, to the United States. They were indigenous to that area. Peruvians, these are mostly people who came to the gold rush. So, in order to get a real view of lynching, you've got to move back the dial. It really starts in the first part of the 19th century. Slavery is still going on. Now, people didn't lynch black people during slavery because you belonged to somebody. They paid good money for you. So they weren't going to come and just gratuitously kill you. The master could kill you if he wanted to, but mostly he didn't. He wanted to beat you real bad and then sell you because he wanted to keep the value that was intrinsic to your body, right? So before this, in the early part of the 19th century, these attacks are on different kinds of people. Most of us have heard that there was lynching in the West, right? You're thinking cowboys and Indians, and some of that is true. But there was wholesale lynching, where there are, I believe that the number that I got from this book is that there were, from another article, 567 Mexicans. It's a lot more Mexicans than we had when the NAACP was counting, right? So these attacks in the early part of the century are situated in a web of other things. It's not just the physical, which is why we got to move past those pictures at some point if we really mean to understand it. It's situated in a web of repressive social, political, and economic cultural practices. So let me just give you a quick example. The gold rush, right? They find gold, everybody goes out that can from all over the world, goes to the West Coast. They come around the other way by ship. Everybody descends on what later becomes California, the Southwest, and the West, the Pacific West Coast. They descend on there and they're digging up this gold. Okay, so the first people to first get there find white gold because it's right on the top. Then they decide that when more people start coming and everybody has decided that this is going to be the way that I make my fortune, then folks start getting selfish about who gets to find this gold. And so the competitivism bears itself, and a lot of these people get literally driven out of the gold mines because the competitors don't want them to have that advantage. And so so this lynching is really mainly on greed, but that's a social control. And they don't want the Chinese and the Mexicans get there first. And the Mexicans know how to dig gold. Remember the Incans? Okay, they know gold. And so they are digging it out, pulling it out the ground, hand over fist. And the Europeans are like, what? And so then they start just robbing them. I don't have time to dig it myself. You dig it, I'll steal it from you. So these practices say, I should, because of manifest destiny, I should have your gold, because that's how God wants it. Right? And so the practices that they put in place, whether it's violence, whether it's legislation that says, I'm going to create a law that says I can take your stuff if I want it, which they do. All of this encompasses the sensibility that creates lynching. And so one of the things that comes out of that is California for Americans. Well, who are these Americans? These people come from all over the world. What Americans? What makes somebody an American? Plus, this is not America yet. This is Louisiana Purchase. After the Louisiana Purchase, this is still territory, okay? They don't let that bother them. So white supremacy is not articulated outright. It's embedded in this concept of California for Americans. Following on that is another one. This is not exhaustive either. These are examples of what I mean by the repressive practices. The foreigners minors tax they levied on foreigners of color, and they had to pay a $20 tax each month in order to keep their digging. Right? You come along, you say, okay, I'm going to dig right here. And somebody would say, okay, and they sell you the right to dig right here. And then the foreigners had to pay $20 a month to keep digging right there, whether you found gold or not. And it was very expensive. There's stories about how an egg costs $50 out there. I mean, so it's very, very expensive. People aren't really making a lot of money. And so this tax that is only going to people of color becomes very repressive at some point. The robber barons come out, they buy up everything. They bring out the railroads, they buy all the land around the railroads. California, by the time it was founded, was owned by roughly 6 people who buy up all that land so that they can control agriculture back on the East Coast, for the East Coast. So they're going to do things that work to their advantage, and particularly against people that have no franchise. Then, of course, you have the land grabs where people can go out and settle the West. All you got to do is come. And you've seen those movies where they're in the wagons and they're racing across so they can stake out their land. This then becomes politicized because only certain kinds of people are allowed to do that. Now, some black people get in on that, which is where the 26 towns come from. But frequently, people will follow behind them, steal it back from them, burn it down, kill everybody, something like that. James Lowen talks about these as sundown towns, that all these towns across America were founded that legally stipulate that only white people may live in them. And finally, dispossession, deportation, ethnic cleansing, racial purging, massacres, lynching, and murder. When all else fails, when legislation fails, get the gun. Okay? So when we rethink this context and acknowledge that lynching is part of this large, oh wait a minute, I'm sorry, I don't have that slide. Go back to the next one. That one. No, that one. That's the one I'm missing. The other reason that we don't know what's happening, that forces us to reestablish this context, is that a lot of the evidence that this happened is written in another language other than English. Mature people in the room, I won't call you out. Remember when you went to college, you had to take a language. You might have had to take a language when you went to high school. You remember that? Yeah. If you didn't take MLA French or MLA Spanish, if you really thought you were smart, you took Latin. Even though you didn't know about it. A lot of people took that because you didn't have to speak it. Right? But you had to take a language. Right? So now these things are not written in English language. Most people don't have to take a language, or you take this much language enough to say, where's the bathroom and do you have cold beer? So that's you're done, right? So if the facts are written in a language you can't read because the education system doesn't want you reading other languages? Because then you might find out something? Okay, that sounds conspiratorial. Let's just say they're written in languages that are not English. They're written in Chinese, they're written in Spanish from the Mexicans, whatever Peruvians speak. And there were a dearth of non-black dissenters. You had Ida B. Wells and W.B. Du Bois running all over the world, stopping lynching for black people. Who are the people that did it for Mexicans and Chinese? You don't know. Because that's not how they did it. They sued. While we were wringing our hands and singing some spirituals, they went on down to the courthouse and they sued, and in many, many cases, they did get reparations. Okay? So, this reestablishes the reestablishes the context of the way we even need to think about lynching. If we're just thinking about it being punitive against black men in the South, you're missing the boat. It's bigger than that. It's way bigger than that. And this is part of the reason we can't get rid of it. This is why today we're still concerned about this kind of violence. So we just need to understand this. Now, the thing about discourse and memes is that they don't have to be little. They're representative. If everything they say and do works to the final point, so that it's embedded in that and you understand that this is what this discourse is doing, it doesn't have to say, find all the black people and kill them. You just devalue them in everything that you write and everything that you do. Do you know that yesterday, I guess because it was on the news today, Raven Simone, did you see that? Where is her mom? She said Michelle Obama looked like she was from the Planet of the Apes.
I thought somebody else said
Someone else said
No, she said it. She said it on YouTube. I saw her say it. She said, oh, but that's not racist, is it? Oh, well, no, you're right. Somebody else said it. But she was saying, but that's not racist, is it? I look like a bird. I look like a parrot.
Right.
The host on Univision.
Right.
Peter Roy.
And she commented on that. Is there an emergency? All your press phones ringing. Is it 9/11? So, when everybody's phones start ringing, it's time to check. Okay, so my point is that that the notion of white supremacy is not limited to white people. That people who want to be who want to be part of the system, have to speak this language in order to get ahead. This is what education is for. Okay, so these are just some examples of the kinds of this web of activities. We won't speed through this. The Indenture Act said that if there were Native Americans who were orphans, and so many of them were because they were killing their parents, right? Or if they were vagrants, what does that mean? You're just waiting for somebody to pick you up on the corner. If you're a vagrant, you would be arrested, and then you would be sold into indentured labor. For a while, you'd be served for many years, and then when you came out, if nobody picked you up on that same corner, you got re-indentured back. This is the new form of slavery for Native Americans. The Fugitive Slave Act says, run away if you want to, we still got you. And we will drag you back because that's the way it's supposed to be. The Army exterminates these indigenous tribes, the Mariposa and the Modocs, because they want that land. Just called in by the government to say, see all those people over there? We got to get rid of them. The foreign miners tax we talked about, and the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is an act of genocide. Now, it doesn't seem like it. This is prevents Chinese women from migrating to the country. So they enforce the culture of bachelors, as they call it. So all these Chinese men are over here with just men. Now, they do let a few women come. Every last one of them, for a while, are prostitutes. And it's so bad that they start bringing children, little girls, babies almost, over, who will grow up to become prostitutes. Not the Chinese people, but the railroad workers.
Are you saying the Indenture Act precedes or?
These are not in order.
Okay, because I'm thinking, because Blackman talks about that act as something that impacts black men especially, so vagrancy laws, is that something different from this?
This is before that.
Oh, okay.
Right,
So
this is
the order-
before that. This is the earliest, but they're still in slavery when they come up with this.
Oh, okay.
So this is before that. These are targeted at these ethnic groups. So the very fact that they don't allow women to come, and finally the only women who can come are the wives of people who own businesses. most of them are forced into what they call coolie labor. Coolie is a derogatory term, not unlike nigger. But they're forced to do that. So if you don't own a store, you don't own a business, your wife can't come. And so you're talking about hundreds of thousands of men with no partners. They call that Oz on TV. Okay. That's not good, is my point. Okay, so one of the ways they do this is to dispossess people of their property or land. And I don't mean land property, I mean the things that you own. We know about the Indian Removal Act, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, cedes California to the United States, and all the people who are living on that then become not U.S. citizens, but unwelcome aliens in the land where they've lived since colonization. The Chinese, the Page Act is the first act that refuses to let women in, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act later restricts undesirable immigrants on the basis of race. Later, we will see that again with the Haitians. Remember when the Haitians were all in Florida and they wouldn't let them in because they were Haitians? This is where it gets its starts. And then at the same time, the Chinese, the Chileans, the Peruvians, the Mexicans, they start this thing where they're purging whole towns, where they round up everybody and drive them out. Now they don't know where you're gonna go, but you can't stay here. And this becomes the way of the West Coast. Okay, go ahead. And then, of course, the African Americans, you have the Black Code, peonage, convict lease and segregation, and Japanese American internment. When they took the Japanese and put them in the prison camps during the Second World War, they took a lot of their property and the things that they owned, and we don't talk about that much either. But it's all part of this same framework. It doesn't stop with just hanging in the woods, okay? So, implicit in this too is the politics of gender. Half of the world is women. Now, how do you get the women to go along with this? The way you do anywhere else. You siphon out some and you give them some privilege. Okay? So, the white women are those that fit, are in the so-called cult of true womanhood. And these are people who embrace these four characteristics. The woman has to be pious, pure, domestic, and submissive. She stays at home, she makes the nest for the husband, he goes out into the world gets dichotomized into two different spheres, the home and the marketplace. The woman supposedly is over the home, but she does that at with her husband's permission, okay? White women are the only women who actually fit into this, even if they don't. They're born into this, they have to do something to get sort of, and it's not real, right? I mean, it's conceptual, to be thrown out of that. But these other groups can't possibly fit into that simply because they're not white. So there's nothing to be done. So these characteristics are the ways that mainstream discourse sees these people. They see Native American women as savage, partially human, and just biologically inferior. They had decided that they would become extinct, and that was fine. They wanted them to become extinct. Chinese people, we talked about that. They were forced into prostitution. They see them as exotic and diseased. And they were diseased, but they were diseased because you take 50 miles back behind the place with no condom, somebody's gonna be diseased, right? So it's not that they're intrinsically diseased, but if you handle them that way, they become diseased. And then there's this other thing, the women that make it over here, the handful of women that get to come, who are the wives of these business owners, have bound feet. Do you know about Chinese foot binding? Don't let them bind your feet, ladies. Okay, it's almost like these real tall shoes, though. It really is. I see people tripping along in these shoes. It's not much different. So that the surface of the foot is about this big. So you can't walk. I think I might need to go to the store. But you can't go to the store if you got a 2-inch foot, right? So Chinese women, there were some Chinese women that came to this country that never saw outside after they got here. Never left the house. Once a year, they might leave the house for Christmas, their Christmas, to go and visit because that's part of their culture, but they never left the house because they couldn't walk, right? So what appears to be a privilege, true with the cult of domesticity, is actually a liability because that privilege limits your ability to do what you want to do. You won't even think about what you want to do if your foot's this big. Okay? Mexican women are exotic, promiscuous, depraved, devious, and lazy. These are not good attributes, right? But they always talk about how beautiful they are when they're writing them. Black women, and ask Raven, are bestial, hypersexual, semi-human, and they believe they didn't feel pain, which is why a lot of them were still working in the field when they went into labor, because they didn't believe you felt pain. So I'm saying that the ways that this narrative constructs gender limits people's power and abilities automatically. Nobody has to even say anything. You create a society where women have no say because there's no reason for them for them to have any say. You don't have to even wrestle, they can't vote yet. Wrestle that out of their hands. So lynch law becomes a social control because it is collaborative violence. Remember, it takes 3 or more people. And after the very earliest days, it's far more than 3 people. It's usually a community of people who come together on behalf of their community to police it, right? So by doing this together, they create whiteness. Without it, they have to have a performative way in order to demonstrate that they are white, because only whites have the right to transcend law and kill with impunity as a means to advance these values. Now, some other people do it, but they don't have the right to do it. And so then they come back and they too are corrected, right? So this changes, again, the frame. So, if we have people who are being purged, they're not, of course, if you're treated the ways that these ethnic groups, including black people, are treated, and I'm starting from the 19th century, the lynching era ends sometime, depends on who you talk to, but let's use their date, it's like the 1940s. If you are controlling who can be educated, who can have say, who can move around, who can have property, how are people to construct their notions of identity in a way that empowers them? How would they do it? Do you understand what I'm asking? Yeah? Okay, so if you're trying to empower women, for example, today,